Okay, folks, if you could move to your seats. Everything's a compromise. You get the view, but you have to have the pillar. So that's just the way it goes. Well, good evening. My name is Evan DeLucia. I'm the Baum Family Director of the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment, iSEE for short, at the University of Illinois. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for our second iSEE Critical Conversation, made possible by a generous gift from the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund, led by Joel Friedman, who's with us this evening. There we go, and Erica. The fund is the founding benefactor of our institute at the University of Illinois and continues to generously support iSEE initiatives like this one that we're going to have over the next day and a half. The Baum Family Fund is committed to bettering the lives of people through health, human services, education, housing, environmental issues, and the arts, and we very much appreciate the support, Joel and Erica. So before we get started, I want to recognize a couple of people that are going to push our conversation forward tomorrow. So we'll have this open lecture this evening, and tomorrow we will go into the heavy lifting of dealing with the issue that we're going to talk about today. But the folks that are going to move us forward and have organized this is Madhu Khanna, sitting in the front row, Professor of Agricultural and Consumer Economics and iSEE Associate Director for Research. Brian Allen, where's Brian? Brian in the back, a Associate Professor in Entomology. Holly Tootin, Holly, yeah, there she is. A vector ecologist at the Illinois Natural History Survey. Chris Stone, Chris, right here. Medical entomology at the history, also at the History Survey, and our event facilitator, Sarah Fisk. Sarah's in the room. There's Sarah from Community at Work in San Francisco. So a bit about iSEE. Our institute was formed in 2013, and it has a threefold mission of fostering and accelerating actionable interdisciplinary research on grand challenges in sustainability, energy, and environment. It also is dedicated to making our campus a national model for sustainability, and we've won several awards in the last couple of years doing that. The thing that we have not gotten an award for that I am most proud of is a 38% reduction in our carbon emissions in the last 5 years. So that was kind of a big deal. And also to train the next generation of leaders in the areas of sustainability, energy, and environment. Inherent in this mission is bringing together the brightest minds in research, sustainability, and education to do what we must do to facilitate frank and open discussions between experts, students, stakeholders, and the public. And that's, with the help of the Baum Fund, what we're going to do in our critical conversation. So what is a critical conversation? In its simplest terms, it's a forum for creative thinking around the toughest sustainability problems, the kind that have contradictory, ever-changing solutions and solution requirements, the kind that don't fall within one discipline, one geographic area, or one area of scholarship. They fall sort of in the gray area between disciplines. You know, things like how do we feed 9 billion people? How do we ensure a clean and abundant water supply? These types of challenges require collaboration among industry leaders, governments, policymakers, all the kind of people that never sit at the same table together, or rarely sit at the same table together. And so that's kind of the goal of the critical conversation, is to get that kind of diverse stakeholder group in one room and one time. To do that, one of the goals of the iSEE critical conversation is really to create an intellectual safe space where this wide variety of stakeholders can come together and debate and challenge each other with these issues. And that's why we essentially go into closed session tomorrow. We run the meeting by Chatham House rules, non-attributional. Try really to encourage people to engage in dialogue that they wouldn't normally feel comfortable doing. Our first conversation, so this is an experiment that we're trying. We're doing this is the second time we've tried this experiment. The first conversation was last year, and we tackled the challenges of nitrogen contamination from agriculture that from our agricultural systems in the Midwest contribute to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was was a very interesting experiment. We had a number of panels, and we had the chief scientist from Monsanto, now Bayer, sitting at the same table with the science director from the Environmental Defense Fund, and that was kind of fun to see. And they didn't hit each other. That was the facilitator's job last year, was to get in the middle of those two and keep that from going. So this year we're going to examine the biological advances and challenges in implementation and regulation of genetically modified mosquitoes for disease control, an emerging environmental, human health, and regulatory concern. In November 2018, the United Nations rejected a temporary ban on the use of gene drive technology, but highlighted the need for case-by-case risk assessment and consultation of the affected communities. You know, we've talked a lot about, and there's a lot of controversy about GMO plants, but GMO plants don't run around or fly around. So this is a whole other dimension of challenge for us. So the use of living modified organisms for agricultural pest control and human disease prevention is a subject fraught with concerns over appropriate use of technology, adequate risk analysis, and science communication. Janelle, Joseph, and I were talking just a minute ago about how far ahead the science is over other aspects of dealing with these issues. We can make organisms now do all kinds of things. The question is, do we want to, should we, and how do we regulate it? And so that's kind of where we're wading into on this issue. In the United States and Africa, recent controversies over the release of genetically modified mosquitoes have underscored the reality that we lack a global framework for assessing biological and social risks associated with GMMs and adequately regulating their development and use. So together, in our conversations tomorrow, we'll outline a research agenda geared toward finding actionable solutions and identifying strategic opportunities for collaboration in this space. But before we get to that, we have an excellent keynote speaker who's going to sort of introduce this topic to our second critical conversation. May Berenbaum, who's a dear friend of mine for, I won't say how many decades because it's getting embarrassing. May is an entomologist known the world over for her research on chemical interactions between herbivorous insects and their host plants, and the implication of these interactions have for the organization of natural communities and the evolution of species. Among her many accolades, May is currently the editor-in-chief of the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, which is causing her no small amount of anxiety, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, former president of the Entomological Society of America, a 2014 Medal of Science winner. She is also a member of the American Philosophical Society and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. At the University of Illinois, one of the things May is very well known for is organizing and originating the Insect Fear Film Festival, which attracts people from all over. And if you ever get the opportunity to come down to campus, you will first enter the room through a petting zoo of all kinds of things you'd never thought you'd want to touch. But then you'll see an opportunity to educate the public about insects through the horrendous job that the media does in portraying them in horror movies and the like. So with that, we're excited to have her with us tonight to present her talk, GMO Mosquitoes, OMG, Cultural Perceptions of Genetic Modification for Mosquito Control. Please help me welcome May to the podium.
Thank you, Evan, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I had kind of carte blanche invitation with respect to what to talk about, and this is an issue that is fraught, but there's a long history of interactions between mosquitoes and people, and I thought one way to sort of ease into the fraught conversation is just take a look over the last century or so of how the cultural context in which the challenges of mosquito management have been set. So I'm hoping that this 100+ years will fit into 45 minutes or so. We'll see, find out. Evan's already given you a heads up about one particular cultural lens through which one can view this interaction. It's literally a lens. So Well, according to the Gates Foundation, mosquitoes are the deadliest animals on the planet, killing more people every year than all the other animals put together. Discovering the role of mosquitoes as vectors of human diseases was arguably the most important medical advance of the 20th century. Well, actually started a little bit before the 20th century. So mosquitoes are responsible, mosquito-borne diseases are responsible for 1 million deaths every year. Almost half the world's population at the risk of malaria. That's 3.2 billion people. That's just a tiny fraction of the disease pathogens they are responsible for vectoring. $12 billion a year is lost in productivity due to work absences caused by mosquito-borne illnesses. More than 40% of the world's population is at risk for dengue infection. Dengue is actually 20 times more common than the flu. And yet it is not nearly as well known or as well addressed. Yet, surprisingly, the role of mosquitoes as vectors of human pathogens has been known for less than 125 years. In fact, the first inklings of an association between human diseases and mosquitoes dates back only to 1897, when Ronald Ross announced to the world that Anopheles mosquitoes are the vectors of the malaria pathogen. He was so moved that he was actually moved to write poetry about this discovery. "Oh, million murdering death, I know this little thing a myriad men will save. Oh, death, where's thy sting? Thy victory, O grave." Just 3 years later, in 1900, Walter Reed, U.S. Army physician, and a team of fellow physicians confirmed the role of mosquitoes as vectors of the yellow fever germ. This was a front-page news story in the New York Times. You can see mosquito carrier carries yellow fever germ, no other mode of infection. This was a landmark study that also, among other things, pioneered the concept of informed consent, but it was the definitive demonstration that had been actually debated for over 200 years as to how yellow fever is transmitted. But until relatively recently, the adversarial relationship between humans and mosquitoes has been mined mostly for humor. It's a little bit surprising. These are all postcards from the turn of the century. Sort of the same running joke. It seems to be a source of great hilarity that bald-headed guys who are asleep or passed out are victimized by mosquitoes. You can see the same joke over and over again. There's another guy that in the good old summertime, things, I don't know what's going on there. No. So, again, very popular sentiment at the turn of the century. Why am I not advancing? Here we go. Even after their role in disease transmission was characterized, attitudes remained, surprisingly, on the lighthearted side. Here's a postcard again from the first decade of the 20th century. The doctors say, now, if you screen your cisterns well with wire and pour a little oil within, you'll kill Mrs. Stegomyia. Okay, not exactly a perfect rhyme, but Stegomyia is the old generic name for Aedes. I like the note on the postcard, but they are still here. And similarly, here is a guy pouring kerosene in the salt marsh in an effort to control mosquitoes, yet, as the other plaintive message states, it is useless. In terms of mosquitoes and postcard humor, New Jersey set the tone for the rest of the country. New Jersey was infamous for its mosquito problems at the turn of the century. Again, a series of postcards. Here you see a native tune from Bayonne, New Jersey. I can't find the cursor, but you can see it up there. And again, dear Edna, sweetheart, does this look like the fellow that bit you, your loving Aunt Minnie? Here is a joke that continues to this day, where the New Jersey state bird is basically a mosquito. And here, political humor addressed to Governor Woodrow Wilson to see whether the New Jersey mosquito would actually endorse the governor. So very New Jersey humor focused on Jersey skeeters. So postcards are an old, sort of traditional form of communication. In 1903, in the earliest years, that's awesome, of commercial story production, film production. So 1903, among the very first of the story films, mosquitoes were featured in what was called in the Edison catalog side splitter animated short, Smashing a Jersey Mosquito. Here's a spoiler alert at the end of the film. There's an explosion producing, quote, great clouds of malarial gas, which enveloped the once happy New Jersey home. This, by the way, was a remake of an earlier short called A Jersey Skeeter, made in 1900 for Biograph. Smashing a Jersey Skeeter was the Edison's remake, and none of these films survive. Winsor McCay was one of the founding fathers of newspaper comics, and among his most popular characters was the Jersey Skeeter, who appeared regularly in newspapers. And he was also one of the inventors of line drawing animation. His movie, How a Mosquito Operates, 1912, was probably the first line drawing cartoon with a plot, and it is that venerable plot of a sleeping, bald-headed guy who gets bitten by a mosquito. Hilarity. So many of the gags in this film continue to appear in mosquito cartoons today. That includes the fact that the mosquitoes are typically male, although only the females bite. The use of can you see that? Yeah. A depiction of mosquito mouthparts as tools, like sharpening on a whetstone, and then ultimately the meal is completed. Now, Jersey skeeters were the preoccupation of Winsor McCay and many newspaper readers, but they were the occupation of John B. Smith, who was the state entomologist from New Jersey at the turn of the century. In 1889, he asked the state legislature to fund a statewide coordinated mosquito control effort, suggesting that once implemented, New Jersey would be able to develop a tourism industry at the New Jersey shore. And according to contemporary reports, the legislators, quote, openly laughed at his proposal. Undeterred, he tackled the meadowland salt marshes and successfully reduced populations of mosquitoes invading New Jersey. In 1901, he advocated scientific research to find permanent relief based on intelligent activity from mosquito problems. 1902, the state legislature approved Smith's $10,000 request for the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station to study mosquitoes, but then managed to omit it from the budget, forcing the governor, at the time Frank Murphy, to allocate $1,000 from emergency funds. 1903 saw the first convention to consider the questions involved in mosquito extermination in New York City, with the Bureau of Entomology chief, the federal entomologist, as it were, Leland Ossian Howard, in attendance. And this was the occasion in 1903 of the formation of the National Mosquito Extermination Society. 1904, he wrote a classic work, The Mosquitoes of New Jersey, making the case that salt marsh mosquitoes require a statewide, not local, effort to exterminate or control. And in 1906, the state legislature actually authorized the experiment station to oversee statewide efforts. So these are the proceedings from the third annual meeting, and there are two phrases worth pointing out. Here is, we all feel that no sacrifice or reasonable expenditure of money would be unreasonable if in the end we could rid the state of this nuisance, the mosquitoes, which is kind of an odd reference. Still, mosquitoes are considered a nuisance pest rather than a threat to life, even though they are now known as the vectors of malaria and yellow fever, which to this day continue to disable or even kill millions of people around the world. The other was a phrase, a concept that will recur over the next century, that the ignorance of the ordinary person in regard to the life history and habits of mosquitoes seem to be more prevalent than it really should be. It was only this afternoon that a bright newspaper man asked me questions concerning the range of flight of certain types of mosquitoes. The lack of knowledge seems to be as fully rooted as the proverbial ignorance of the Englishman toward this country, who thought we were living in the woods and fighting savages on our way to our daily business. So after World War I, pesticide application technology changed dramatically with the use of airplanes, which are recommissioned from the war effort, and along with the adoption of cheaper calcium arsenate as the principal insecticide and mechanized improvements in pesticide delivery. So it's now possible to deliver pesticides over a much broader area. So in 1934, the Fleischer Studio released a Betty Boop cartoon featuring the adversarial relationship between humans and mosquitoes, not surprisingly, mining it for humor. The film was called Something About a Soldier, and it basically depicted the war between mosquitoes, giant mosquitoes advancing on the city, and the human population. What's particularly striking about this cartoon is that 16 years after the end of the Great War, where there was tremendous loss of life, particularly to chemical warfare, it's depicted here as kind of hilarious. You can see the pesticide clouds choking the mosquitoes to death. Yeah, priceless. In terms of popular culture, a Broadway play opened in 1934 depicting the devastating effects of arthropod-borne disease, yellow fever, and the heroic work of the medical professionals who elucidated the role of mosquitoes as vectors. It was called Yellow Jack. It ran on Broadway, and it was soon thereafter made into a movie. Now, this was the status quo up until World War II. And one of the sort of cultural shifts in World War II is that there were many American soldiers returning from the Pacific Theater and elsewhere where endemic mosquito-borne diseases were causing major loss of life, which created the need for a re-education campaign to acquaint the population with the actual the mortal threat posed by mosquitoes. So most of these educational films were live action and only intermittently humorous. Here, Criminal at Large has a character, Aniophile, a dangerous female killer. The U.S. Public Health Service, the U.S. Signal Corps, and the Office of War Information all commissioned educational films for the public featuring mosquito-borne diseases, including yellow fever and malaria, as well as DDT, which soon became a household word. For low-literate soldiers, however, actually serving overseas, humor mixed with large helpings of mild profanity, sexual innuendo, and racism were the order of the day. So this is one of these Army films, actually U.S. Navy film, Commandments for Health, Taking Medicine from the Hugh Harman Productions, featuring a character called Private McGillicuddy. The purpose of this educational film was to exhort soldiers to take their malarial prophylactic medicine. And they did this with really incredibly racist stereotypes and pretty lowbrow humor. Again, here's the bald-headed guy, but also naked buttocks seem to be a source of great amusement here. This was, because they were classified, they were freed from Hayes Office censorship. The Hayes Office was a sort of moral standards office that policed films, but not for the military. So again, first commandment, taking medicine. Thou shalt take without griping the medicine issued for the prevention of malaria and other diseases. At least some of the symptoms of malaria were accurately depicted here, where you see the alternating chills and fever that typify malaria. Private Snafu was an invention of the U.S. Army Air Force First Motion Picture Unit. The contract went to Leon Schlesinger at Warner Brothers because the Disney studio wanted exclusive rights to characters and merchandise, and the Army wasn't willing to grant that. Most of the scripts were actually written by Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, and they were pitched at low literate learners, and they were, again, classified not subject to the Hayes Office Code for Decency. And Private Snafu, and everybody's probably familiar with the acronym stands for, was essentially an incompetent idiot. Kind of surprising we won the war, but they were humorous. So two of these, there were all kinds of things, how to avoid sexually transmitted diseases, how to maintain hygiene. And there were two of them on vector-borne diseases, Private Snafu versus Malaria Mike. And It's Murder, She Says. You may recognize it. Chuck Jones is the name. He was sort of one of the principal animators of Bugs Bunny. So again, malaria Mike, male, not female, alias a mosquito, right? A mosquito. It's actually the punchline of a knock-knock joke. And again, bald guy, naked buttocks, laughs galore. Here you see the soldier depicted as a delicious meal for mosquitoes, rationed, of course. Versus Malaria Mike continued that venerable combat theme where humans are at war with mosquitoes. And again, the depiction of mouth parts as weapons. And there you see the target for tonight. Its murder, she says, featured Anopheles Annie, also known as Malaria Mall, a sort of bibulous alcoholic, the drinking problem, who again targets the sleeping bald guy, and only to be thwarted by crowds of entomologists and epidemiologists. And once again, we have the poisonous gas cloud as the ultimate solution to the mosquito problem. Disney did finally enter into this realm of health-related educational shorts with one called The Winged Scourge, which was produced by the studios and the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs exclusively for Latin America. It's also the only one that used established Disney characters, the Seven Dwarfs, which seems kind of like an odd pairing. Basically, viewers are taught about how mosquitoes spread malaria and then how to prevent them, prevent acquiring malaria. And it's a straight-up, serious documentary on malaria, which goes through the life cycle, the symptomatology of malaria and the like, and then segues into the Seven Dwarfs happily pouring oil in swamps and spraying clouds of pesticide. There's Dopey with a flit gun. So. And by 1946, these were so familiar that there was a genre ripe for parody. Warner Brothers came in again. Michael Maltese and Fritz Freleng, also Bugs Bunny, associated with Bugs Bunny and other beloved Warner Brothers characters subsequently, is a parody of World War II documentaries, and the title of the iSEE refers to one. And Target for Tonight, that was a typical documentary there. The narrator briefs the audience on a mosquito attack on a picnic. And many of the same jokes. There's the squadron of enemies in flight. There's the mouth parts as tools or weapons. Actually, it's a Swiss Army knife, and actually 6 parts, just like mosquitoes actually do have 6-part proboscis. Target for tonight, buttocks. Tools for sharpening, and there's the frit gun rather than the flit gun. Squadrons, and of course, spoiler alert, the ultimate success of the mission. So during the war, DDT had become a household word. It was distributed and patented post-World War to the general public. So dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, DDT, it's not actually its official chemical name, but the contributions of DDT to the war effort was a key marketing tool after the war ended. DDT was, the insecticidal properties were discovered in 1939 by Paul Mueller, a German chemist, and the Defense Department bought up and manufactured, this is a synthetic chemical, enormous quantities, and used them to head off a typhus epidemic in Italy. It was really the first time typhus had been stopped during wartime. Historically, typhus is a louse-borne disease. It killed more people than all of military weapons over the years. So it was really a striking victory. And aerosol dispensers as well, which were used during the war as foggers or bombs to create slow-to-settle fogs for treating mess halls, barracks, and tents, were modified for civilian use, and thus began the marketing campaign. Are these the identical DDT bombs used by our armed forces? Yes, it was almost your patriotic duty to use DDTs. You see, now available to civilians. By 1948, so insecticidal properties discovered in 1939, by 1948, Mueller had received the Nobel Prize for Medicine for discovering the insecticidal properties. And his Nobel speech didn't really provide any insights into any possible downside of using DDT. In fact, other than an anecdote whereby he described his experience working with the substance, my fly cage was so toxic after a short period that even after very thorough cleaning of the cage, untreated flies, on touching the walls, fell to the floor. I could carry on my trials only after dismantling the cage, having it thoroughly cleaned, and after that, leaving it for about 1 month in the open air. So without any warnings, DDT sort of firmly embedded itself in popular culture. Here's the DDT is good for me, helping produce all kinds of good things for America. It was incorporated into wallpaper and paint for children's nurseries. Here's a promotional issue of Nebraska Farmer celebrating DDT and its many useful attributes for housewives. Again, you could paint with it. This is 3 necessary jobs. It is paint, it kills flies, it kills disease germs, and it makes your walls white. It was freely dispensed around and on children, and if you're of a certain age, probably remember running after mosquito fogger trucks, freely sprayed on kids. There's actually a Facebook page called I Used to Run After Mosquito Fogging Trucks from Levittown, Pennsylvania, where I grew up and where I used to run after mosquito trucks. Now, 2 years before Paul Mueller won a Nobel Prize, Herman Muller won a Nobel Prize for his work in 1927 showing that X-rays induce mutations in fruit flies and for determining the frequency of gene mutations and chromosomal rearrangements increased with radiation dose. So this is basically the discoverer of the connection between radiation and mutation. But unlike Mueller, he did have a few cautionary words. Irrespective of their causes, natural or otherwise, mutations are overwhelmingly disadvantageous. That was a key message in his Nobel Prize lecture in 1946, reported in Time magazine. In Washington last week, small blue-eyed Dr. Mueller, glowing with the stimulation of his newly won Nobel Prize, gave us a pessimistic interview. Most mutations are bad, said he. In fact, good ones are so rare, we can consider them as all is bad. It would be fortunate, he thought, if all those exposed to an atomic explosion, such as the people of Hiroshima, were to be made permanently sterile. For this reason, he's known as the gloomy Nobel man. Then the Lucky Dragon incident occurred. On March 1st, 1954, a Japanese tuna fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, was sailing in the Marshall Islands where the U.S. was testing its Castle Bravo thermonuclear device on Bikini Atoll. The boat, the crew, the fish, and the fish catch were all contaminated by nuclear fallout. All 23 crewmen were severely burned, and 1 died within a year as a result of the contamination. The incident received international coverage by the press, and when people learned that the contaminated fish catch of the Lucky Dragon had been sold to consumers, that almost led to the collapse of the Japanese fishing industry. However, it sort of rejuvenated the movie industry because by November of that same year, the movie industry weighed in with Gojira, known in its many, many remakes as Godzilla, the radiation-spewing prehistoric lizard. And apologies to those who heard my talk last November. There were 2 people who did. So this is, yeah, anyway. So this marked the beginning of the giant insect fear film genre where irresponsible experimentation with radiation leads to giant killer insects. Now, Them was the first insect mutant movie. It was released in 1954. It's the biggest box office profit maker for the studio, Warner Brothers studio. Whatever is plot summary, whatever is killing people near an atomic bomb test site leaves behind a strange footprint and a predilection for sugar. The Department of Agriculture dispatches myrmecologist Dr. Harold Medford and his daughter Pat to gather evidence and persuade local law officer skeptics that the killers are ants. The officers are convinced when a 12-foot ant appears behind Dr. Pat as she's carefully dusting off a footprint. In Beginning of the End, which followed 4 years later, 57, this is from the pantheon of Bert I. Gordon, who was a director known at the time as Mr. Big, not only because his initials B-I-G, spelled big, but because most of his oeuvre involved oversized creatures. Experiments are being conducted in the USDA lab in Rantoul, Illinois, using radiation to end world hunger by producing giant vegetables. This work had unfortunate side effects. Hungry giant locusts that, after having eaten giant vegetables, head north to destroy Chicago. And you can see the Wrigley Building here, or at least a postcard of the Wrigley Building where giant locusts are scaling the outside of the building. So they're gone now. Yeah. This is actually the source of one of my favorite lines in all of insect fear films. Peter Graves plays the heroic entomologist who has to confront the military because their plan to deal with giant locusts in Chicago is to drop an atom bomb on Chicago. Whereupon he responds, "You can't drop an atom bomb on Chicago," which is sort of a masterful understatement, I think. And they don't. Spoiler alert, actually they use the sounds made by locusts to lure them in to Lake Michigan, and where they drown. Unfortunately, Bert Gordon did not know, he used giant Texas lubbers for this movie, and he did not know they're cannibalistic. So by the time he actually filmed the climactic finale, he was down to only like a handful of locusts in a pan of water, which was a stand-in for Lake Michigan. So laboratory studies in the 50s revealed that a variety of insect species were actually able to tolerate radiation exposures hundreds of times greater than doses lethal to humans. And in some species, as this paper by Cork 1957 demonstrates, radiation actually prolongs their lives. Such findings might have inspired the idea that cockroaches will inherit the post-nuclear apocalyptic hellscape world. And with that meme has not died, nor has concern about radiation ever abated. However, the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962 changed attitudes about pesticides and subsequently any new technology, introducing new fears of mutation and food web contamination. So this is a Saturday Review cartoon. I had just come to terms with fallout, and along comes Rachel Carson. So this was an important attitudinal change in the general public to become increasingly skeptical about new technologies. It soon became apparent that DDT and other pesticides, like radiation, can cause problems, including mutation, in this Nature paper from 1971, and bioaccumulation up a food chain, including this paper from the Science of Total Environment, illustrating the distribution of DDT up multiple levels of a food web. So, of course, that was grist for cinematic mills. Food of the Gods was a Bert I. Gordon movie from 1976, updated a story based very, very loosely on an H.G. Wells short story. He's probably still spinning in his grave, actually. That to include this food chain revenge element, which is a very common theme of movies in this time period. A mysterious substance seeps out of the ground and causes animals that eat it, including a mosquito and a chicken, to become enormous and belligerent. So here you see the standoff between the giant angry chicken and the farmer defending his farm. This may be the first appearance of a giant mosquito in film, so very little of what Bert I. Gordon was really innovative, so this might be one we can credit to him. A giant mosquito appears in this movie. Spoiler alert again, the final scene is of kids drinking contaminated milk. So no sequel ever appeared, but you can probably write it yourself. In 1976, he did produce another movie based on toxic food chains, Empire of the Ants. Radioactive toxic waste is dumped into the ocean and contaminates a nearby very sketchy real estate development, which gets considerably sketchier when contaminated ants grow to enormous size and become intelligent. This is Joan Collins, by the way, the unscrupulous realtor. In addition to killing potential homebuyers, these ants enslave the local population by spraying them with pheromones and forcing them to run the local sugar factory for them. Giant mosquitoes also appear in Skeeter in 1993. They show up in an abandoned mine after an unscrupulous developer uses the mine for dumping his illegal radioactive toxic chemical waste. For some reason, in the 90s, I guess unscrupulous developers were sort of the standard bad guys of moviedom. But this is a classic environmental revenge movie. An investigator brought in states, "You people have a problem here in Clear Sky. I'm here to tell you whether it's environmental." And it was indeed. And then, not quite in this genre, was Mosquito from 1994, where enormous mosquitoes were produced as a result of sucking the blood of alien beings which had crash-landed somewhere in Michigan. One of the most innovative aspects of this film is that the mosquito pest management involved the use of chainsaws. It doesn't really fit the storyline because aliens are not, sort of anthropogenic changes, but it really needed to be included in this talk. So by the 1970s, science caught up with science fiction, and yet another introduction of new and frightening technology, matter transfer, was depicted in the 1958 film The Fly, recounting a scientific experiment that goes horribly awry and leads to a clearly unsustainable interspecific intermingling of matter. And in a poster that keeps nothing secret, this is like a final scene in the movie, The Fly with the head of a man and a man with the head of the fly. For your own good, we won't let you see it alone unless you sign a waiver in our lobby absolving the management for the unpredictable effects of the fly on your nervous system. And in fact, $100 if you could prove it can't happen. Interesting aside, David Cronenberg saw this movie as a young kid and thought that he had an explanation, that it wouldn't have worked because there was a certain number of cells in a fly part that you couldn't expand to take the place of the human head, and he never got his $100, but he did get his revenge by remaking this movie with Jeff Goldblum about almost 20 years later. So matter transfer wasn't even real, it wasn't even possible back in the 50s, but by 1972, Paul Berg at Stanford University combined monkey virus DNA with lambda virus DNA to create the first recombinant DNA, which earned him part of a 1980 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. The following year, in 1973, Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen inserted genes for antibiotic resistance into a plasmid of E. coli, the bacterium, creating the first transgenic organism. A year after that, the same team expressed genes from the African clawed frog, Xenopus laevis, in a bacterium, creating the first organism engineered to express a gene from an organism belonging to a different kingdom. And that same year, Rudolf Janisch and Beatrice Mintz inserted non-mouse retrovirus DNA into a mouse embryo, creating the first transgenic animal. Now, the creation of transgenic organisms generated widespread concern in the scientific community about potential risks. And an extraordinary, now legendary meeting was convened in 1975, the Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA. At the meeting, 140 people, including biologists, physicians, and lawyers, met to write voluntary guidelines for safe recombinant DNA research, really unprecedented. These are scientists sort of regulating themselves. Among the principles to emerge from the meeting, importantly, mechanisms for fully informing the public. After Asilomar, advances continued to be made in the laboratory. In 1978, bacteria were genetically engineered to produce human insulin. 1980, the Supreme Court determined that a genetically engineered organism, such as a bacterium engineered to break down oil, constitutes a novel manufacture and hence is patentable. 1982, the Food and Drug Administration approved genetically engineered insulin produced by bacteria. 87, genetically engineered mice expressed the human gene encoding tissue plasminogen activator protein. In 1988, a U.S. patent was awarded to Harvard University for oncomouse, a transgenic non-human mammal. Well, this did not set well with activists, among the most famous of whom was Jeremy Rifkin in 1977, who invoked the timeless metaphor of playing God in a book literally called Who Should Play God? The Artificial Creation of Life and What It Means for the Future of the Human Race. Then went on to found a think tank to oppose legislation enabling this technology. Around that same time, in 1986, stable expression of the luciferase gene of a firefly, Photinus pyralis, in tobacco represented the first transfer of animal DNA into plants. Luciferase, along with its substrate luciferin, ATP, and oxygen, is what makes fireflies glow. This experiment did more than give rise to jokes about lighting up tobacco. It marked the beginning of a great adventure for firefly genes that ended up in petunias, wheat, corn, and even tomatoes. Its function, though, is a reporter gene. There was no intention of expressing it in corn so farmers could harvest at night. It was because it was a marker for the geneticists to recognize that the gene that they were, the transgene that they were moving around had actually landed in the right organism. And it was a marker, a reporter, because it glows. In 1991, DNA Plant Technology Corporation of Oakland, California announced successful expression of antifreeze genes from an Arctic fish in a tomato. This was a proof of concept experiment. They never intended to market this tomato. But panic ensued nonetheless. Paul Lewis, an English professor at Boston College, sent a letter to the New York Times in response to an op-ed questioning the safety of GM tomatoes, writing, "Ever since Mary Shelley's Baron rolled out his improved human flesh out of the lab, scientists have been bringing such good things to life. If the GMO corporations want to sell us frankenfood, perhaps it's time to gather the villagers, light some torches, and head to the castle." This may have been the very first use of this term frankenfood. And fortunately, in 1992, the request for FDA approval of the Flavor Saver tomato was followed by the release of Jurassic Park in 1993. And Rifkin and his think tank embraced the movie's Frankenstein metaphor, picketing theaters showing the film and passing around flyers depicting a dinosaur in a basket labeled Biotech Frankenfood. So who's afraid of Jurassic Park here? Now, Frankenstein was the creation of the novelist Mary Shelley in 1818. Almost a century later, the first film version appeared in 1910, depicted there. And then more than 200 films that reference the Frankenstein story have been made since. The concept of Frankenstein, if not the monster itself, is deeply embedded in contemporary popular culture. Now, Dr. Frankenstein in Shelley's 19th century story was a tragic hero punished for his hubris in attempting to create life. The form of my monster on whom I had bestowed existence was forever before my eyes, and I raved incessantly concerning him. The contemporary creators of Frankenfood, by contrast, are widely depicted as greedy, amoral, opportunist bent on world domination. Here you see we engineered it so that it's resistant to the most annoying pests. Of course, the most annoying pests are scientists trying to police agribusiness. And here, genetically modified salmon is being tested just by releasing it to the general public. So backlash, just the idea of GMO food, before it was even available, was fast and furious, ultimately ineffective. By 1996, the first GM commercial crops were approved. Lawsuits filed by Greenpeace and allied participants in the lawsuit to block genetically manipulated crops. They were suing EPA. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2000 for lack of evidence, and the potato variety called New Leaf was released by Monsanto, its first genetically modified food crop. Introduced in 1995, it contained the endotoxin of the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis, which is an insecticidal toxin that actually kills Colorado potato beetles. Potatoes did not sell well. McDonald's stopped using them in 2000, and Monsanto actually discontinued its seed sale. But not before the theme was picked up by a television show called Strange World, an episode called Food in 2000. So this featured a transgenic potato. But instead of killing Colorado potato beetles, Captain Paul Turner of U.S. AMRID is called in to investigate a mysterious death associated with a gas leak, discovers that the potato is transgenic. It contains DNA from some kind of bacteria. Methane is a bacterial byproduct. We splice genes from a bacteria, should be bacterium, in the potato's DNA. The bacteria lethal to the potato's most destructive pest, the Colorado potato beetle. Technically, this potato is a pesticide, at least according to the FDA. This is how we're going to feed the world. You're holding a foot soldier in the revolution. We're splicing flounder genes into tomatoes to improve frost tolerance. We're adding firefly genes to corn to make the stalks phosphorescent so they can be harvested at night. No, we're not. GMO plants running amok really wasn't much of a genre. There are two movies appeared in 2004 featuring GMO plant foods. Bite Me, which is genetically enhanced marijuana in a drug deal gone wrong, is nibbled by spiders in a strip club who then began wreaking havoc, sucking patron and stripper blood. And then in 2004, corn, genetically engineered corn, turns sheep that eat it deadly. Yes, a killer sheep movie. Larva in 2005 features genetically altered livestock feed produced by an unscrupulous meat packing company that, when consumed by cows, converts their internal parasites into blood-sucking, stomach-bursting, flying creatures that attack and kill people and threaten, God forbid, the nation's hamburger supply. And then, after a long hiatus, genetically modified corn returned to the big screen. In 2015, the movie Consumed earnestly depicted consequences of genetically altered corn, allergic rashes in humans, and once again, oversized chickens. Now, genetic modification of insects, first achieved in 1982, seemed to have inspired more filmmakers than genetically modified flatulent vegetables producing clouds of methane. In 1988, The Nest was released. It was the first movie to feature genetically engineered mutant insects. This is despite the review in the New York Daily News that stated, quote, "It broke little ground in the way of new bug movie ground. It broke little in the way of new bug movie ground." It was actually the first genetically engineered bug movie. The mayor of Northport Island is working on a deal with a secretive firm called Intech, seems to have no employees and keeps its records in a cave. Mysteriously, every book in the town library turns up missing pages. The meat department in the local grocery store stripped bare overnight. Turns out Intech has developed a genetically engineered cockroach designed to eat other cockroaches in an effort to circumvent pesticide resistance. What could possibly go wrong? The mutants now eat cats, dogs, people, and library books, and then metamorphose into whatever they have eaten. In 1997, a somewhat better reviewed movie called Mimic by Guillermo del Toro, featuring Mira Sorvino, who recently won an Academy Award. So this movie featured brilliant entomologist Susan Tyler engineering the Judas breed, a cockroach mantis termite hybrid, to stop a polio-like plague in New York. The hybrids escape, regain the capacity to reproduce, and in 3 years of living in the subways of New York, evolve to breathe with lungs, become predators on unsuspecting humans, and assume human form while hunting their prey, hence the film's name. And a year later, stably transformed yellow fever mosquitoes were created using a transposable element from a fly, with a lot less drama. So stable transformation, unlike the process depicted in the 1958 movie, the Hermes is a transposable element that was used as a jumping gene to alter the eye pigment of Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito. So sequencing mosquito genomes beginning in 2002 facilitated the development of novel targeted methods for controlling disease transmission in the pests themselves, which led to all kinds of speculation in the press of new approaches to fight malaria. And this announcement of the sequencing of the genome was accompanied, again, by a remarkable paper reporting on the results of a workshop, Genetically Engineered Arthropod Vectors of Human Infectious Diseases, sponsored by the World Health Organization, the MacArthur Foundation, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and London's Imperial College. Basically, again, a self-policing efforts and a discussion among the genetic modification community as to how to proceed. Perhaps the most important theme emerging from the workshop, according to the article in Science, recognition that control strategies involving GMOs could potentially provoke serious public mistrust and resistance to implementation. The goal of producing GMOs intended to benefit human health has been perceived more favorably by the public than that of producing GMOs for agriculture or domestic animal research. However, meeting participants strongly argued this positive public perception could be rapidly undermined by an actual field trial of a transgenic arthropod that failed to produce a significant tangible health benefit to a resident human community. So genetic engineering with genomic tools proceeded apace. Mosquitoes that manufacture antiprotozoal peptides that stop pathogen development, mosquitoes that produce mouse-derived antibodies to block pathogens from infecting mosquitoes, mosquitoes with supercharged immune systems that render them resistant to pathogens, mosquitoes with lifespans too short to permit maturation of the pathogen were all produced, and all could provide inspiration for alarming headlines and sci-fi screenplays. Among the most disturbing scenarios for many was the intermingling of human genes with the genes of other organisms. Back in '95, Walter Gehring and his collaborators showed it was technically feasible, first expressing a fruit fly eyeless gene, which encodes a transcription factor. The transcription factor regulates the development and determines where a particular gene is expressed in a gene product is made. Finding its, by moving this around, these investigators could cause eyes to develop in places where eyes don't normally appear, like all throughout the rest of the body. Perhaps more alarming, this PAX6, this eyeless gene has an ortholog or homolog in mammals called PAX6, or small eyes in mice, aniridia in humans. It's a transcription factor, over 90% identical. You can take this human transcription factor gene, express it in fly embryos, and cause the same effect. So here is a fly antenna with an eye at the end, put there by a human transcription factor. Yes, David Cronenberg would be hard-pressed to explain this. Now, this work, as impressive as it was, almost certainly did not lay any foundation for Mosquito Man mutant movies, of which there are at least 2. This is Mosquito, also known as Mosquito Man. Dr. Jennifer Allen is dedicated to finding a cure for the Gillen virus, a mosquito-borne virus so bad it'll, quote, make West Nile seem like the common cold. She's working with a team to genetically engineer a cure, a mosquito incapable of carrying the virus. Her supervisor, anxious about investors, decides to test out the mosquitoes on a convicted serial killer. Again, what could go wrong? And after an explosion in the laboratory, this convicted serial killer begins to transform into Mosquito, sucking human blood all over town. In the lab explosion, Dr. Allen also is exposed to radiation and DNA, and she starts mutating as well. Mosquito will not go away, however. He's waiting for Dr. Allen to transform into Womansquito or Mosquito, Mamsquito, for mating purposes. Sucker in 2013 featured an almost identical plot line 8 years later. Jim Crawley's day is going badly. He loses his job. His car is impounded. He finds out his wife is having an affair with his rival, and a scientist conducting unauthorized tests on a vaccine against a dangerous mosquito-borne virus, sound familiar, kidnaps him. The mix of radiation and mosquito DNA turns him into a mosquito-man hybrid, and he similarly runs amok. About the only original aspect is the wonderful tagline of this movie, "Payback's an itch." As genomic tools evolve, so do many movie plot lines, sometimes just by coincidence. With accidental prescience in the TV film Locust, the Eighth Plague, 2005, the Silogen Corporation engineers locusts so they're all carnivorous male drones programmed to die in 48 hours. Okay, so why would you render an herbivorous insect that occurs in plagues that actually can wipe out large populations by depriving them of food and make them carnivorous. In any case, they're programmed to die in 48 hours. Though in the movie, they spontaneously change gender and breed with amazing rapidity, allowing the protagonist to explain spontaneous adaptation. It's a trait fairly common to amphibians and reptiles, but in the insect world, it's incredibly rare. I don't know where that one came from. In reality, one contemporary approach today actually used to control mosquitoes genetically involves the use of a bacterial pathogen called Wolbachia that renders males sterile and short-lived. Almost entirely a coincidence, I'm sure. Now, given the level of cultural anxiety, even professionals by 2007 were skeptical about whether transgenic mosquitoes could actually ever be deployed. This was a result of a survey after a plenary debate at the Fourth Multilateral Initiative on Malaria Conference in Cameroon in 2005. The debate was titled, "Is a transgenic mosquito a weapon against malaria ever going to fly?" The black is basically yes, so you can see down here, right here, unless the GM mosquito approach is carefully monitored and steered by an international network, it will fail. And that's almost 3/4 yes. And then, having heard this presentation, views from the audience, will GM mosquitoes ever fly to control malaria? Just 1/3 of the respondents said yes. Things weren't much better in 2012 when British company Oxitec, after successful releases in the Cayman Island and Brazil of transgenic mosquitoes, proposed releasing them to reduce dengue transmission in the USA. From this article, Key West says no to Robo-Frankenstein mosquitoes. Key West inhabitants have branded Oxitec mosquitoes with names like Robo-Frankenstein mosquitoes, mutant mosquitoes, and superbugs, using rhetoric lifted from movies like Jurassic Park and Hunger Games. A community survey in Key West revealed that most opponents to GM mosquitoes thought disease risk was low. And that's, remember, an issue all the way back from the turn of the century, that the residents were likely to oppose mosquito use if they had a low perception of the potential risks posed by disease, like dengue and chikungunya, which are mostly tropical, at least up to date, up to this point. So this is the frequency of chosen reasons for supporting genetically modified mosquito use. One of the positives for people supportive was that it reduced pesticide use, so the lesser of two evils. Again, lingering concerns about pesticides. In general, though, the majority of respondents were not supportive. Among those opposing, there were just overall concerns about genetic modification, possibly the playing God angle, but a significant number of people were also alarmed about transferring mutated genes to human animals, which that's the mosquito concept right there that some people seem to embrace. So this was very politicized in the Keys. There were many protests. Mosquito battle gets political. Jurassic Park invasion. So again, movie themes predominated. In retrospect, maybe Florida wasn't the best place to try this experiment, but, given the population. One of the real, I did collect a number of stories called A Florida Man involving insects, but we'll save that for another lecture. One of the problems is dogged advances in genetically modified mosquito research is they always seem to coincide with another Jurassic Park movie. So that link in the popular conscience is never far away. It does not help that the whole franchise was launched with the blood in a fossilized mosquito. Then Zika turned up at the southern border of USA. Zika is a virus that was known in Africa since the 40s. Mysteriously, however, became quite prominent and sort of swept through South America, creating some horrific neurological symptoms, including Guillain-Barré in adults and microcephaly, or failure of head and brain development in developing fetuses, giving rise to the birth of children that was truly disturbing. And then it crossed the border into the US. Mosquito-borne transmission was documented in the USA by 2016. And this had major impact on attitudes. Once the myths were dismantled. This was a February 2016 Annenberg survey. More than 1/3 of Americans believe that genetically modified mosquitoes actually spread the Zika virus. That wasn't the worst of the conspiracy theorists. Russia accused Bill Gates of engineering bioweapon Zika viruses. Gates' vaccine plot generates from Nazi eugenics. This is a scenario whereby the Rockefellers brought this virus back from the 1940s and sort of stockpiled it for population control. Ultimately, people began to understand more, but there was still not a great endorsement of use of genetically modified mosquitoes. Interestingly, so that 75% were opposed, 3% were neutral, 22% were supportive. And the biggest reason for opposing generally was the use of genetic modified organisms, but importantly, it was also mistrust of government or industry. That's huge at 24%. In fact, the greatest differences between comments from people opposing GM mosquitoes were human health. 61% of those opposing cited health risks, 86% supporting GMMs so actually cited health benefits, and then mistrust of government. So that was a concern for 30% of those who opposed genetically modified mosquito use versus a tiny fraction who supported it. So this fear of government and industry, unscrupulous real estate developers, among other things, dating back to the 60s when in rapid succession, pesticides and radiation started causing problems. Now, Americans' views have changed about genetic engineering of animals. And in fact, there's just as was pointed out in the 2002 conference, that mosquitoes get a pass in some ways. Genetically modified mosquitoes to prevent spread of disease is 70% of respondents in this Pew survey say it's appropriate use of technology versus only 20% who say it's appropriate to make aquarium fish glow by not modifying them. Okay, now new genomic tools such as CRISPR-Cas9, which allow gene editing, introduce new possibilities and new concerns. Gene editing isn't sufficient to control populations, but partnered with gene drive technologies, including CRISPR-Cas9, an edited gene can spread through an entire population rapidly. So it offers new hope against disease and crop pests, but is it too risky for field trials? New debate. The fact that there are now readily available, technologically straightforward and inexpensive methods to edit germ lines to alter the trajectory of evolution in just about any organism, including humans, and even to drive a species to extinction has people very worried and introduce what may be a historically new concern about mosquitoes, is that we could make them go extinct. We can literally eradicate them using this new technology. Would that be a bad thing if it's a mosquito? Interesting debates. So these mosquito trials sparked another movie reference, the Sorcerer's Apprentice lab fears, where this is a technology that goes out of control. Remember the scene in Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice, where the marching brooms end up wreaking havoc. That's the result of gene drive. Would it be wrong to eradicate mosquitoes? Now, from this survey done by a pest control company, 80.2% of people would eradicate lice, ticks, and mosquitoes. But surprisingly, there is recognition of a downside. I'm going to have to read this. Okay. This was eradicating a deadly disease could also cause a significant decline in bird populations. So there are ecological consequences. Playing God with mosquitoes. Again, this recurring Frankenstein theme. Are we better than this? But maybe anthropogenic activities will spare society from having to ponder whether eradication is ethical or not. Because according to Hollywood, maybe global climate change will lead to the universe's ultimate revenge for our anthropogenic changes to the universe in the form of the movie Insectula. This is a giant alien mosquito that is drawn to Earth it's attracted by this carbon dioxide that we are producing and releasing into our atmosphere. Long established by entomologists that carbon dioxide attracts mosquitoes. Well, on a global scale, it attracts giant alien mosquitoes who could maybe solve all of our problems for us by driving us into extinction. And with that, thank you. I don't know if you want questions, or if there can possibly be questions.
Let's have a few questions for May and then continue it in a more casual environment over cocktails next door. But why don't you entertain a few questions?
Yeah, there's a microphone to use if you have a question. Please have a question. I hate when this happens. No questions? Okay, do you want to grab the mic? It's right back there, all the way in the back. Can you bring it? No, I guess you can't. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. I wonder if you could comment on a myth that is common even among scientists, which is that there is a balance of nature, and it's this web that you can't disturb any part without disturbing everything, and this sort of source of opposition to this technology.
Again, this balance of nature concept goes back decades in ecology. And it's kind of I guess a rather crude, idealistic view of how populations interact. Different communities assemble and how populations interact. It's really difficult to predict what effect removal of a particular species will have. It doesn't really have to do with balance or imbalance, but there are, in fact, in certain communities, keystone species. That's not really recognized in general discussions of the balance of nature. But there are some species that, because of their ecosystem services, have disproportionate effects on other species. An example that illustrates this, I think, particularly well, are fig trees, figs, genus Ficus, throughout the tropical communities are so-called keystone species in that they are the major resource for multiple communities of organisms. They fruit pretty much continuously. Many organisms depend on those fruits, depend on foliage, so the entire community is built around fig trees. Ultimately, though, the real keystone species are the pollinators of these figs. Many, if not most, fig species have very strange reproductive biology, and many of them are very closely co-evolved with a particular pollinator species, a tiny Agionid fig wasp. So each fig has its own fig wasp. They're not interchangeable. So if you lose the pollinator, you lose the fig tree, you lose the community, which is not to say that everything else in that community goes down with it. I mean, there are other plants, there are other interdependencies. So, plant ecologists used to think that communities were made up of certain puzzle pieces, only all clearly defined, and when there's community change, they change as sets of organisms. They all act independently and distribute themselves independently and then sort of form associations rather loosely. But there are associations that have these interdependencies. We don't know enough to be able to predict them. And that's the problem. Another question?
I disagree because bats and fish and other insects, I mean, they are in the food chain, and we don't know if they were eradicated, what effect it would have. So I don't think it's a myth. I think we're unsure of what the effect
we
would
just
be.
don't know. Again, balance is a subjective term, and it's always hard to discuss humans because we're here, like it or not, we're here. Again, we don't know what interactions there are that are sustaining other interactions.
May,
Yes.
how would you, I think that's a great question, and how would you contrast that with invasions or occupations of empty niches, which we see as well, and this idea of upsetting a balance when maybe you're trying to control an invader?
Well, and actually, empty niche is a concept that not everybody embraces either. So,
Right. Yeah, sure.
when you talk about ecology, things get a little challenging. The thing about invasive species, many of them follow in our wake because we disturb things. So we create many opportunities for invasive species. So we're already talking about a disturbed system. That said, Aedes aegypti is native to Africa. It arrived here most likely on slave ships, breeding in the water containers, sort of condign retribution for slavery here. It now is largely an associate of humans. So it lives in and around human habitats, flower pots, soda cans, the trash that we accumulate around where we live. So the argument's been made is it's invasive, it doesn't belong here, it feeds exclusively on humans, we can get rid of it, no one will be harmed. It turns out that's not exactly the case, that it's exclusive. There are so-called sylvan cycles in wood in South America, not native, but it has established itself in sort of undisturbed, non-human habitats. And again, we don't know what it's doing. So if you could make a case for eradicating a species that affects only humans, like smallpox, if you can consider a virus a species, has no other hosts, it's not exactly clear that Aedes aegypti has no other hosts or any other ecological function. Sadly, we just don't know. We are appallingly ignorant, despite our conviction that we know everything we need to know. I don't know if that's oh, yes.
I have the mic, I'll ask because of...
Okay. You have another question?
Yes, I'm thinking about
Esther.
public distrust. How do we go around it? Is the recent interest in science communication doing anything, because we are bound to have newer technologies? And then I liked how scientists do self-policing. I wonder if we broadened that and brought in the public at that time when we are having these broad self-policing discussions, how would that turn out?
Well, that's what happened at Asilomar. That was truly a remarkable event, but it was 1975, and it has not really been repeated, despite many opportunities to use that same approach. This is a constant battle, and you can see how, in the face of it, absurd some of the scenarios are that people have cooked up. And a lot of it comes down to this recurring theme of distrust of government and industry. And that's deeply ingrained. To some degree, scientists are more trusted in many polls, but there is this lingering distrust. We can go back to the essentially propaganda of the 40s and 50s about radiation, and including the 60s. I mean, Rachel Carson was thoroughly trashed by the pesticide industry, mercilessly and unfairly and inaccurately disparaged by a coordinated disinformation campaign, which should not be unfamiliar to any here. This is a recurring theme. There's maybe some good reasons for distrust. So it's a fight we can't give up on. And it goes back, you saw, into the early days of that first discovery that mosquitoes are vectors of human diseases. And I, for the life of me, cannot figure out why everyone thought they were amusing for 50 years, for more than that. the different attitude about lice, there's a different attitude about houseflies. L.O. Howard, when it was discovered houseflies were vectors of typhoid, dysentery, cholera, yaws, other human pathogens, he launched a publicity campaign called Swat That Flies. The fly swatter, as we know it today, was only invented in like 1905. People tolerated flies. There's a whole rich body of literature about how flies and humans are both humble creatures, and after that propaganda campaign, flies are viewed as they are today as disgusting, filthy vermin. When we think about it, they breed in manure and then they sit on your sugar bowl. So this is not a good arrangement. That was a successful propaganda campaign, but somehow, it's hard to get people to protect themselves against West Nile. We have, the internet, the two-edged sword. We have the most effective way of getting word out to billions of people, and yet we see misinformation traveling 10 times faster than actual accurate information. So this is not a constructive, helpful answer. I don't know. Well, you guys maybe tomorrow can figure this out. So.
Well, I guess I was following up is to realize the importance of it, but what do you as an entomologist and other entomologists and scientists, what can you do about it? And I guess a second quick one, I appreciate your comprehensive presentation of all the cultural representations, and I was curious, either I missed it or why you left out the Hellstrom Chronicles?
Well, the Hellstrom Chronicles, not technically an insect fear film. Right. This was a documentary. This was, for those who don't know, 1971. New macro photography, very innovative. In fact, at the Cannes Film Festival, it won Best Documentary. But the studio would not release it commercially until a framing device was spliced into the film, where there was a Dr. Hellstrom who was driven insane by the realization that insects are taking over the world, was sort of, this beautiful documentary was dropped in the middle of this framework to make it commercial. And so it occupies an odd place in the pantheon of bad insect science fiction.
But what have you done and other scientists to, I guess, address the issues and concerns raised by these films and representations?
Well, that's why we have our Insect Fear Film Festival. In fact, the Mosquito we showed at the Female Entomologist Fear Film Festival. So we identify a theme, and then we had a genetically modified organism fear film festival as well. We showed Mosquito. And actually, Gunnar Hansen, the same chainsaw-wielding, I think his name was Leatherface, showed up in Mosquito using a chainsaw to decapitate giant alien mosquitoes. So the mosquito biologist, I recommend this highly. It's very satisfying to watch this movie. So. All right. Thank you, everybody.
You once again for fantastic. Hopefully she can stick around for a few minutes and enjoy some wine and cocktails with us. I think there's a bar across the hall, and the person you want to see on the way there is Amy, because she has a ticket to dispense that will get you what you need.
Okay. Hi there.
There are some invasive